My time starts now. In a world where the stability, safety, and quality of life of the citizens from developing countries lies solely in the hands of one Western country with completely unstable international policies, we think we completely jeopardize the lives of millions of already struggling people, which is why we are so proud to propose the motion this House supports a multipolar world to US hegemony. So as the first speaker on side government, I'll be providing a few definitions just to clarify the motion and also two contentions. Firstly, about how this motion would decrease the risk of conflict and war, and secondly, about how the US, specifically as a democracy, is unfit to be a hegemon. So moving on to my definitions. We define this house as the world, and we define multipolar as basically the world, in this world, hypothetical world, there is no hegemonized country. So major powers do not at all attempt to hegemonize, right? However, we think there are alternatives similar to hegemony, but are more beneficial and less harmful. I will give you a few examples in my speech. So moving on to my first contention about how it decreases the risk of conflict and war. So we think in the status quo, there is a lot of international tension, right? Specifically with the US and China, not only in like the trade war, but also both are competing in like hegemonic power, etc., right? So we think two major militaries that are the strongest in the world fighting for power in many smaller and less powerful countries, we think is utterly problematic. So basically the ultimate goal of these two countries, US and China, is to gain complete hegemonic influence, and we think this really encourages conflict and ultimately war. So yes?
Wouldn't that also happen in a multipolar world?
No, it wouldn't, because in a multipolar world, basically no country, especially the US and China, are like basically just no country in general are allowed to hegemonize other countries, right? Meaning that no country will compete to hegemonize other countries, therefore decreasing the risk of conflict, right? That's what I just explained. But also, we think, like I said before, two competing powers with the strongest militaries in the world, they also both have like previous tension already and rivalry. We think both of them will not back down easily from like, succeeding in hegemonizing this developing country, especially when both countries are aware of the benefit of successfully hegemonizing this country, right? So we think China, as like especially a major rising power, highly prioritizes like power and other international influence, etc. And we think this would like ultimately strike a lot of, or further raise tensions between US and China. And we think this leads to like both countries, if it escalates enough, we think both countries will be forced to use like military power and physical force, right? So we give two impacts for this contention. First of all, it could lead to war in the developing country, which both major powers are trying to hegemonize. So we think the poorest citizens are basically left the most unprotected in this potential war. So because they have no money, they have no power to escape or to properly protect themselves. So we think this ultimately just harms the quality of life of developing country citizens and potentially killing like hundreds of thousands of them. We think the second impact is on escalation. So if the conflict in the developing country escalates, then we think there is like a very increased risk of full-blown, like a world war, right? And we think a full-blown world war would obviously lead to like detrimental effects, right? So like I said before, the two strongest militaries in the world, no thank you, competing for like hegemonization and like basically causing like a full-blown war. We think this war is no longer obviously about like hegemonizing this specific developing nation. So obviously, this would lead to like deaths, not only in that like nation, but also just all around the world, right? Resulting in basically like millions of deaths, potentially even more, right? So because both countries with these strong militaries have developed and destructive weapons. If war escalates enough, we think they will use them, right? So this looks like bombings, mass shootings, etc. We think this is ultimately, no thank you, very detrimental, and we would not prefer this world on our side. So moving on to my second contention about how the US, especially as a democracy, is unfit for a few reasons. Firstly, we think democracy as a regime obviously changes very frequently, right? What we mean by this is like in the US, every 4 years, for example, there is a potential shift in presidency. And in this shift in presidency, there are basically two opposing parties with very different or even opposing international policies, right? So every change in presidency will lead to a potential policy shift. We think this is very bad because developing countries and how they are run by the hegemon will change very often. So this leaves a developed country with absolutely no time to adjust to their economy and their society in general. And basically, this leads to no thank you, no development at all for this hegemonized country. I'll take your POI.
Oh. Are you aware that in a multipolar world, it's actually better for these presidents to shift because of, more perspectives, and so therefore there won't be a big dictatorship or something like that?
No, okay. So basically, what we mean is we don't think shifting ideologies is particularly bad. But what we mean is by shifting international policy specifically and changing the way the hegemon will run these developing countries means that these developing countries really don't have any time to adjust to these new policies, and therefore their economy will never really grow. Okay, and secondly, we think that many US policies don't even bother governing this hegemonized country properly. For example, Liberia, right? Since Trump's policy, the US is barely present in governing Liberia, right? There's basically no effort in developing this country, and basically while other African countries are massively improving their economy, Liberia remains completely grounded. We think this is obviously a direct result of US hegemony. So we think there are also a lot of alternatives to hegemony that benefits both the hegemon and the hegemonized country without causing much harm, right? We think the US can perfectly profit off international influence while also benefiting the influenced country instead of what they are doing right now in the status quo, right? For example, China, their BRI, and Pakistan, right? So China has basically built a port in Pakistan, and Pakistan basically is in China's debt, right? So still in this situation, we think Pakistan will benefit from the port either way. So the worst case scenario would be that Pakistan fails to pay this debt. So we think China can basically just extend the time they are allowed to pay this debt, or basically, in the worst case scenario, take over the port for 99 years. Still, we think in this worst case scenario, Pakistan can still benefit from the port, right? Direct benefit will obviously go to China, but we think ports obviously would directly stimulate trade and stimulate the economy, right? Because products are shipped and brought into Pakistan that would not have been there if not for the port built by China, right? So the result is basically that Pakistan gets stimulated trade and therefore leads to a better economy. This cannot happen if China's goals were to completely hegemonize Pakistan, right? This can only happen if Pakistan is multipolar. So we think this, like I explained before, is obviously a better alternative than what the US is doing in the status quo, which is why we're so proud to propose.
And I call upon the proposition first speaker to conclude the debate with a 4-minute summary. You're here.
My time starts now. They make it seem like US influence will magically make everything better, but when we look at legitimate, realistic cases of US hegemony, we see a suffering economy, a failing democracy, and a lot of suffering citizens, which is why we are so proud to propose this motion. As the summary speaker on side government, I'll be providing two major points of clash that this debate has boiled down to. First of all, about democracy, I'll be refuting their whole point about how democracy makes everything better, and how the US will apparently establish democracy correctly. And secondly, I'll be telling you which side better benefits the hegemonized country in general. This includes the point about economy and such. So moving on to my first point of clash about democracy. So on their side, they often repeat that democracy will be undermined under our side of the house, and they say that democracy is good, and they say that opposition to democracy would increase under this motion. We think this is completely false, because to make a country democratic, you cannot just like rename their regime and leave it at that, right? You need to like root the ideology of beliefs of like democracy, right, into the beliefs of citizens, right? So we think this is obviously not happening in US hegemonized countries. For example, like Liberia, like I said before, not many of their citizens truly believe in democracy, and democracy really is just like a title that the US has given to Liberia and nothing more than that. We think the result will be like the opposite of what they claim in their impact. We think there will be more opposition against democracy, right? What we mean by this is like poor countries and citizens will realize that the US is basically like screwing their entire economy, etc. And they will realize that this is the US's fault. Therefore, they're a lot less inclined to believe in democracy itself. And many more people will actually oppose democracy because they blame the US and what the US has done to their economy and their country in general. So therefore, we think that citizens are much happier without without hegemony and like democracy, basically, in this specific case. Moving on to my second point of clash about which side better benefits the hegemonized country. So they gave this point about how democracy gives people a choice, etc. We already refuted that in our previous class, right? And we gave you this point about how hegemony also causes conflict. And basically the response was this would not, like, conflict would not happen. Okay, so they basically refute my point by saying that if countries are multipolar, then it means that they're like distinct countries, obviously. And they think that if there are more distinct countries, then there will be more war, which, like, if a country is independent, they will not just start conflict solely because they are now independent and distinct, right? They give absolutely no reason why they should just randomly start a war only because they are no longer hegemonized, right? So also we gave you this point about how the hegemon can boost a country's economy without monopolizing it and then forgetting about it, right? We gave you the example of China, the BRI, and Pakistan. This was absolutely not touched by their side, not refuted, not even responded to, not even mentioned once. So we see this point still stands, obviously, and we also have this point about economy, right? So they give you this point about how the reason why the economy in Liberia is struggling is because the world is shifting into like a more multipolar ideology, etc. They mentioned this repeatedly, but we think this is utterly false, because a few years after the US hegemonized Liberia, it already gave up, right? Way before the idea of multipolarism even became popular, and their economy and currency was monopolized. Then the US completely dropped it, and there was no real reason behind like just the US completely giving up and dropping Liberia's economy. So we see that like Liberia's ruined economy and many other ruined economies because of US hegemony is not because of multipolarism. It is because the US is not should not be like a hegemon. For these reasons, proud to propose.